The courtroom was quiet enough to hear a pen click. He clicked it once, signed his name, sat down, and smiled. Not wide, not cruel, just the corner of his mouth. Private, certain. He had just lost everything, the house, the cars, the savings, 22 years. And the people in that room were watching a man who looked like he'd won something nobody else could see. The judge stopped writing. His wife's attorney looked up from her briefcase and went still. His wife looked at his face and found nothing she recognized. He folded the papers once, tucked them under his arm, nodded at his attorney, did not look back. The courtroom doors swung open. His footsteps crossed the marble hallway. The doors closed behind him like a period at the end of a sentence that had been 22 years in the making. He walked to the bus stop. Both cars belonged to her now. He sat down, put his hands on his knees, and somewhere behind those quiet eyes, something was already moving. The day Jerome Caldwell signed the divorce papers, he smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just the corner of his left mouth. A small, private thing. But the courtroom was quiet, and in that quiet, that tiny smile was loud. Judge Anita Hargrove looked up from her paperwork, studied his face. Her expression gave nothing away, but her pen stopped moving. Camille looked over from the plaintiff's table. Those deep brown eyes, the ones Jerome had spent 22 years trying to read, moved across his face like she was searching for something she'd misplaced. She didn't find it. Patricia Graves, Camille's attorney, glanced at Jerome and for the first time in 4 months of proceedings, looked uncertain. Just for a second. Then she smoothed her jacket and went back to her papers. Nobody in that room understood the smile. Not the clerk, not the bailiff, not Renee, Camille's younger sister, sitting in the gallery with her arms folded and her jaw set like she'd already won something. Not even Jerome. Not completely. He felt it more than he understood it. Something releasing. Something that had been held very tight for a very long time, finally letting go of itself. The clerk slid the papers across. The pen was cheap plastic, the kind that skips if you press too hard. Jerome clicked it once, signed his name, pressed steady. He had just lost the house, both cars, most of their joint savings. 22 years compressed into a settlement figure that Patricia Graves had somehow made sound reasonable. He was walking out of this building with $500 and a garbage bag of clothes he'd already arranged to have picked up. And he was smiling. He set the pen down, folded his copy of the papers once, tucked them under his arm, nodded at his attorney, a decent man named Terrell, who had done what he could with what he had. Did not look at Camille, did not look at Renee, walked to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, pushed them open, and stepped into the marble hallway. The sound the doors made closing behind him echoed off the walls, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Outside, the February air hit him flat and cold. He stood at the top of the courthouse steps and looked at the parking lot below. Bare trees, gray sky, a city moving on without noticing him. He walked down the steps, turned left toward the bus stop, because both cars belonged to Camille now. He sat on the cold bench and waited. An older woman 2 seats down didn't look up from her phone. A man in a work jacket stood at the curb eating a sandwich like it was the most important thing happening anywhere. Jerome put his hands on his knees, looked down at them, and thought about a box, a small lockbox, currently sitting in the back of his brother-in-law's trunk, underneath the garbage bag. A box with a padlock he'd bought at a hardware store on Alameda 3 years ago. Inside the box, a brown envelope he hadn't opened in 14 years. He'd held it maybe 100 times. Picked it up, put it back, locked it away again. Tonight, for the first time, he thought he might open it. The bus came. He got on, paid the fare, found a seat by the window, and watched Houston blur past. He didn't cry. He didn't pace. He didn't call anyone. He just rode the bus. And somewhere in the back of his mind, quiet as a held breath, something that had been waiting a very long time began to stir. 11 months before the divorce papers were signed, on a Wednesday night in March, Jerome Caldwell found a receipt in the pocket of his wife's vest. The gray one, the fitted one she wore to client meetings. The one she tossed over the back of the bedroom chair. When she got home, same as always. He wasn't snooping. He was moving it so he could sit down. His fingers found the paper before he knew what it was. He unfolded it in the dim light of the bedroom. Camille was already in the bathroom, shower running. A restaurant on Westheimer. One he'd driven past 100 times, but never been inside. The kind of place with tablecloths and a hostess who knows your name. Dinner for two. A bottle of wine Jerome couldn't have identified, but knew enough to know was expensive. The date was March 14th. A Wednesday. The timestamp said 8:47 in the evening. Camille had told him she was working late with a client. Jerome stood there in the dim bedroom with the receipt in his hand. The shower ran. Steam drifted under the bathroom door. He read the receipt once, then again, then a third time, like the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made a different kind of sense. They didn't. He stood there for what felt like a long time. Could have been 2 minutes. Could have been 10. The shower kept running. Camille had a habit of letting the water run hot before she got in. Jerome used to tease her about the water bill. He didn't feel like teasing anyone about anything right now. Here's what he didn't do. He didn't walk to the bathroom door and knock. Didn't confront her with the paper in his hand the way they do in movies. The door swinging open, the steam rolling out, everything coming apart in one ugly scene. He didn't call her phone, didn't check her texts, didn't pace the kitchen rehearsing what he was going to say. He folded the receipt, carefully, put it in the pocket of his own jacket, hanging on the hook by the door. Then he went to the kitchen, opened the drawer by the stove, where he kept a small notebook, the kind he used for everything, grocery lists, work notes, ideas that came to him at odd hours. He wrote the date, the restaurant name, the time, closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer. And when Camille came out of the bathroom in a robe, hair wrapped in a towel, and asked if he wanted tea, he said yes. They drank tea at the kitchen table. She talked about a difficult claim she was managing. He listened, asked a follow-up question. She seemed to relax. He went to bed, lay in the dark, stared at the ceiling, and didn't sleep for a long time, because Jerome Caldwell was not an impulsive man. Never had been. His mother used to say he came out of the womb already thinking things over. His father used to say the same thing, with more pride and less patience. Jerome moved slow when other people moved fast, waited when other people rushed. He needed to know what he actually knew before he decided what to do with it. So he waited. He paid attention. And over the next 4 months, with the quiet, methodical thoroughness of a man who spent his career tracking logistics across a supply chain, Jerome Caldwell built a very clear picture of what had been happening in his marriage. He didn't hire anyone, didn't buy any software, just watched, listened, cross-referenced, the way he'd always done with everything that mattered. By July, he had phone records. By August, credit card statements that told a story nobody had tried to hide very carefully. By September, a photograph from a parking structure camera on Westheimer that he was not going to describe to anyone, if he could help it. He kept everything in the notebook, and when a notebook got full, he started a second one. Both went in the box, under the padlock. Jerome and Camille Washington had met at a cookout in the summer of 1998. Not a party, not an event, just a backyard gathering at a mutual friend's house in 3rd Ward, the kind with a borrowed speaker system, and somebody's uncle manning the grill like it was the most serious responsibility he'd ever been given. Jerome had arrived early, which was what he did, and was standing near the back fence with a cup he wasn't really drinking from when Camille walked through the back gate. She was wearing a yellow sundress, sandals, hair pressed straight, catching the afternoon light. She was laughing at something the woman beside her had said, a full laugh, unself-conscious, the kind that didn't care who was watching. Jerome was watching. She didn't notice him for another 40 minutes. When she finally did, she gave him the kind of look that said she'd noticed him noticing and had decided she didn't mind. They talked for 2 hours. He drove her home. She gave him her number. He waited 3 days to call, which she later told him she found annoying and then reassuring in equal measure. They married 2 years later in a small church on the east side. 30 people. Her mother cried through the entire ceremony. Jerome's father squeezed his shoulder before they walked out and said, "Take care of her, son." That's the whole job. Jerome took that seriously. For the first decade, things were good. Not perfect, not the kind of good that makes for dramatic stories. The kind of good that feels like reliability, like someone being there when you get home, like knowing without thinking about it that you're not alone in the specific way that marriage makes possible. They bought a house in North Houston, saved carefully, built something. The cracks came the way cracks always come. Not all at once, not with a single dramatic moment, just gradually, the way a foundation shifts so slowly you don't notice until the door starts sticking. Camille started wanting more, which wasn't wrong in itself. Jerome understood ambition. He had it too, in his own quieter way. But Camille's wanting shifted from their life to other people's lives. She started measuring what they had against what she saw around her. Dana, her college roommate, had married a developer and moved into a house with a media room and a wine cellar she posted about 3 times. Phyllis from the office flew business class twice a year and had been to 4 countries in 18 months. Camille started holding their life up against those lives, and every time, their life came up short. Jerome noticed. He worked more, picked up projects, tried to close a gap that kept widening not because of money, but because of something he couldn't quite name. Something that lived in the way Camille stopped asking about his day. The way she answered his questions, with her eyes already somewhere else. He thought it was stress, a rough patch. He bought her flowers twice. She put them in water and didn't mention them. He suggested they take a trip somewhere. She said maybe later. Later never came. Then came Darius Holt, 47 years old, originally from Atlanta. Commercial real estate developer. 5 years in Houston by the time Camille was assigned to manage his corporate insurance portfolio. He drove a black Range Rover and wore watches that cost more than Jerome's monthly salary and had the kind of smile that arrived exactly when it was most useful. He told Camille she was extraordinary. Told her she'd been wasted on a man who drove a 10-year-old Camry and talked about freight routing at dinner. Told her she deserved better. Camille didn't believe him immediately. She wasn't naive. She was sharp, always had been the kind of woman who read a room before she walked into it. But Darius was patient, and Camille was tired. And tired people, even sharp ones, can be worn down by patience. By the time Jerome found that receipt in March, Camille had already decided. She wasn't drifting away from him. She was running towards something. She just hadn't told him yet. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in late October. Process server, brown envelope. Jerome was eating cereal at the counter in his socks. He read them once, then again, then a third time. The language was cold and precise and utterly devastating. Emotional unavailability, psychological distance, chronic neglect. Patricia Graves had built a portrait of Jerome as a man so withdrawn, so absent within his own marriage, that his wife had been suffocating in silence for years. None of it was entirely false. Some of it landed in Jerome like something true he hadn't said out loud to himself yet. But all of it was arranged to serve one purpose, and that purpose was not the truth. Jerome sat on the bottom stair of their house and read the papers until his cereal went soggy in the bowl he'd forgotten he was holding. That night, Camille came home late. She moved through the kitchen without speaking. Poured a glass of water. Jerome said, from the living room, "I got the papers." She stopped, didn't turn around. "Okay," she said. "Just that? Okay." She went to bed. The hearing took 4 months. Darius Holt's money flowed quietly into the effort without ever appearing on a document. Patricia Graves was known in Houston legal circles for exactly this kind of case. She built her narrative carefully, methodically, out of half-truths and strategic arrangements of fact. She brought in Renee, Camille's younger sister, who had never particularly warmed to Jerome, and let Renee describe family gatherings where Jerome had retreated into himself while Camille worked to keep everyone together. She presented bank statements from particular periods where Camille's contributions to household expenses were higher. She produced a therapist Camille had seen twice, who had somehow written a 7-page letter about emotional toll. It was a masterwork of narrative architecture. Jerome's attorney, Terrell Bridges, pushed back where he could. But pushing back requires documentation, and Jerome had made a decision about his documentation. The night before the final hearing, Jerome sat with Terrell in a small conference room with bad overhead lighting. Terrell laid everything out on the table. The phone records, the cross-reference statements, the photograph from the parking structure camera. Terrell said, "With this, we take back the house. Probably both cars. We can test the asset division entirely. We walk out of there with a completely different outcome." Jerome looked at the photograph for a long time. "Put it away," he said. Terrell looked at him. "Put it away, Terrell. We're not using it." "Jerome, I heard you. We're not using it." Terrell put it away. Asked no more questions. He was a good attorney. He understood that sometimes the client's decision is the client's decision. Jerome drove home, sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, went inside, made coffee he didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He knew why he'd made that call. Not in words yet, not the full version, but in feeling. He didn't want to win by cornering someone. He didn't want the settlement to be the thing holding his marriage together, or the ending of it. He wanted Camille's choice to be her choice, made freely, with no walls he'd built around it. And he wanted his own freedom to mean something. He went to bed, slept surprisingly well, and the next day, in that quiet courtroom, he signed the papers, took the $500, and smiled that small, private, unexplained smile that nobody in the room could read. 14 years before all of this, before the receipt, before the papers, before the marble courthouse hallway, Jerome Caldwell took a half day from work to attend a seminar at a convention center near downtown Houston. The event was called Emerging Technologies in American Energy Infrastructure, which is about as exciting a title as a title can be, which explains why 43 people showed up to a room that held 200. Jerome was there because of a paragraph he'd read in a trade publication 3 weeks earlier. Something about battery technology. Something about the way energy storage was going to reshape everything about how power moved through a system. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't explain why. Just knew there was something in it he needed to understand better. He sat in the third row, took notes, sat through 2 presentations that were exactly as dry as the room temperature. Then Calvin Webb walked up to the podium, 29 years old, shirt that needed ironing, hair that needed a decision made about it. He had the energy of someone who'd been kept in a small space for too long and was finally allowed to move. He started talking, and the room changed, not because everyone leaned in, but because Jerome did. And sometimes one person's attention is louder than a room full of distraction. Calvin Webb was talking about solid-state battery technology, about a company he'd co-founded called Solaris Energy, about patents they were building, timelines they believed in, a future that was going to arrive whether the room was ready or not. 3 people left during his presentation. 1 fell asleep. Most of the remaining audience had the expression of people doing mental math about how much longer this would take. Jerome was taking notes so fast his handwriting got sloppy. After the session ended and the room began emptying toward the parking structure, Jerome walked to the front. Calvin was packing up his laptop with the slightly deflated energy of a man who'd just given everything he had to a half-empty room. Jerome said, "I have 3 questions." Calvin looked up. None of Jerome's questions were about the technology. They were about supply chain, about what happens when the technology works and you have to actually move it through a system, source the materials, build the infrastructure, get it from the people who make it to the people who need it. Calvin Webb set his laptop bag down, answered every question, then asked Jerome what he did for a living. Jerome told him. Calvin said, "You think about systems. Most people hear this pitch and think about the technology. You're thinking about what happens after." They talked for 40 minutes in an emptying conference room with the fluorescent lights flickering on the back wall. 3 weeks later, Jerome transferred $14,000 into a personal investment account he'd held since his mid-20s. Separate from everything. Not a joint account, not tied to anything he shared with Camille. He'd never gotten around to merging it, had just left it sitting there mostly dormant, which turned out to be one of those accidents that only look like wisdom in retrospect. He wired the money as a seed investment in Solaris Energy. He didn't tell Camille. Not because he was hiding it. Not exactly. More because he knew what her face would do. He'd seen that face when he talked about things that genuinely excited him. The slight flicker. The moment where her attention moved to something else, and the rest of her expression stayed in place out of politeness. He didn't want to see that face about this, so he didn't say anything. Solaris sent him paper statements every year. Annual reports on performance, share valuation, company development. Jerome read each one carefully, made a note in his small notebook, put the statement in a brown envelope, and locked the envelope in a small box under the shelf in the closet. The share value climbed in the first 2 years, then plateaued longer. Jerome kept the box, kept the statements, kept not telling Camille. During the years, when money was a source of friction in their marriage, and there were several, he never mentioned the investment. When Camille wanted the kitchen renovation, and they couldn't afford it, he said nothing. When she compared their finances unfavorably to Dana's and Phyllis's and everyone else's, he said nothing. He wasn't sure he could have explained why, if pressed. Something about keeping one thing that was only his. One small act of faith in something he believed in alone. The plateau broke in the spring before the divorce. Solaris had cracked a critical problem in solid-state cell density. The patents they'd spent a decade building suddenly had a different kind of value. An automotive manufacturer came calling. Then 2 energy conglomerates. A bidding war developed in executive boardrooms Jerome had never been invited into and would never see. The share value didn't climb. It detonated. Jerome didn't know this yet. He found out later, much later, in a room on Delmar Street with a thin mattress and a radiator that knocked at night like someone asking to come in. The room was on the second floor of a gray brick building that had been waiting for renovation for longer than Jerome had been married. He paid $340 a month. The window overlooked a chain-link fence. The bathroom was shared with 2 other tenants whose schedules he learned by sound, one who showered at 5 in the morning, one who came home at 2. He found work at a warehouse facility near the port within his first week. Early shift, the kind of job that starts in the dark and ends when your body tells you to stop. Loading, unloading, inventory, double shifts when they came available. They almost always came available. Most people said no. Jerome always said yes. His hands, which had spent 15 years working a keyboard and phone, cracked open in the first week from the cold and the work. He wrapped them at night with the bandaging tape he found at the dollar pharmacy on Delmar. Got up before the alarm. Went back. He lost weight he didn't have to lose. His face went sharp where it had been soft. His eyes went still in a way that people on the bus occasionally glanced at and then looked away from, not knowing what they were seeing, but sensing it was something they didn't want to disturb. Every evening, before he slept, he took out the small notebook, wrote one line about the day, not a journal, not feelings, just a line, a record, something to keep the days from blurring together. $12 at the pharmacy. Double shift approved for Saturday. Rain all morning. Left hand bandaged again. Simple things. True things. The kind of accounting a man does when he's trying to keep himself in order. The box from the closet, the one with the padlock, the one with the brown envelope inside, was under his bed now. He'd carried it in his lap on the bus the day he moved into the Delmar room. He kept it under the bed. Checked on it some nights without opening it. Just put his hand on the padlock and left it there for a second. Then put his hand back on the mattress and went to sleep. Meanwhile, on the other side of Houston, Camille Holt, she'd taken his name, which somehow was the detail Jerome's mind kept returning to without warning, was living a life that photographed beautifully. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, she and Darius married. A rooftop venue in the Galleria area. Jazz quartet. Open bar. The ceremony was small and private. The reception somehow generated 47 social media posts. She wore white again, a different kind of dress this time. Darius wore cream and smiled his wide, precisely timed smile. The mutual friends attended. People Jerome had known for years. People who had sat across from him at dinner tables and asked about his work and laughed at his dry jokes, attended the wedding, and seemed to manage the transition without visible difficulty. People are good at adjusting their loyalties in the direction of apparent success, better than they like to think. Camille's social media became a documentation project. The Range Rover, a weekend in Miami, a restaurant she'd always wanted to try. Renee was in half the photos, the same woman who had sat in the gallery at the courthouse, with her arms folded, now laughing in Camille's kitchen in a new house with better countertops. Someone from Jerome's old workplace forwarded one of the posts to him without comment. Just forwarded it. Jerome looked at the image for a moment, then put his phone face down on the thin mattress. He had work at 5 in the morning. He slept. The only person who visited him on Del Mar Street was his sister Evelyn. She didn't call ahead. Just showed up one Saturday afternoon, knocked, and stood in the doorway of room 214 with a covered container in each hand. She looked at the room, the mattress, the 2 extra blankets folded at the foot, the small kettle on the shelf, the padlock box visible under the bed from where she stood. She didn't say anything about it. She sat down on the edge of the mattress, there was nowhere else to sit, and set the containers down and looked at her brother. "You okay?" she asked. Jerome sat on the floor, back against the wall. "Getting familiar with okay," he said. Evelyn nodded. She was not a woman who filled silence with sound. She let it sit. They ate the food she brought, talked about the small things, her hours at the hospital, a neighbor whose dog had learned to open the gate, a book she'd been reading that she'd maybe bring by next time. She didn't ask about Camille, didn't ask about the case, didn't ask about money or the future or what his plan was. When she stood to leave, she picked up the empty containers, looked at the padlock box one more time, and said, "You keeping that safe?" "It's safe," Jerome said. She nodded, left. He sat alone in the quiet room, after her footsteps faded down the hall, listening to the radiator knock. Outside the window, the chain-link fence caught the wind and moved. He thought about the envelope. 14 years. He'd bought Solaris Energy at 29 cents a share with $14,000. Hadn't touched it. Hadn't looked at it the way you look at an investment you're monitoring. Just held it the way you hold a thing you believe in, so privately you don't need it to perform. He pulled the box out, held the padlock, put it back. He wasn't ready tonight. But he was closer than he'd been before. Something about signing those papers, something about the smile he hadn't been able to explain, it had changed the texture of waiting. Before, waiting had felt like enduring. Now it felt like something was moving toward him. He couldn't have said what. He just knew it was close. He turned off the light, lay down on the thin mattress with the 2 extra blankets pulled up. The radiator knocked. The fence moved in the wind. Down the hall, one of his neighbors laughed at something on television. Jerome Caldwell closed his eyes and slept better than he had in 2 years. 6 weeks into Del Mar Street, Jerome Caldwell had learned something nobody tells you about starting over. It isn't dramatic. That's the thing. Movies want you to believe that hitting bottom has a certain quality to it, dark and cinematic, and full of meaningful silences, where the protagonist stares at himself in a cracked mirror and decides to change. What actually is administrative, tedious. The same 4 walls every morning. The same alarm at 4:45. The same 11-minute walk to the bus stop in the dark. Not tragic, just small. And small, it turned out, was something Jerome could work with. The alarm went off at 4:45. He was usually already awake. Not because his mind was racing, that phase had passed somewhere around week 3. More because his body had negotiated a private arrangement with a mattress, and the arrangement was this. Around 4:30, the mattress announced itself through his lower back, and he could either acknowledge it or argue with it. and arguing with it never worked. So he'd swing his legs over, sit on the edge, give himself 30 seconds. Just 30, not more, because more than 30 led to thinking. And thinking before 5 in the morning was not a useful activity. Not yet. Not here. 30 seconds. Stand up. Kettle on. Oatmeal from the box he bought at the dollar grocery 2 blocks down. Check the left hand, wrap it if it needed it. And it usually did for the first few weeks, until the skin found its new understanding with the work. Jacket. Out the door. The warehouse near the port smelled like cold metal, and something underneath it he never identified, but eventually stopped noticing. The work was physical in a way his body remembered from his 20s. Lifting, moving, counting, stacking, the kind of labor that empties your head completely and leaves something cleaner behind it. Cleaner was what he needed. He was good at the work, faster than people expected, quieter than they were used to. The floor supervisor, a man named Dion, who carried the specific energy of someone who had seen every version of every situation and had strong opinions about all of them, watched Jerome for 3 days without speaking. On the 4th day, he handed Jerome a clipboard. "You know what you're doing," Dion said. Not a question. "Yes," Jerome said. Dion walked away. That was the whole exchange. Jerome was fine with that. He didn't talk much at the warehouse. There were men there who processed the day through conversation, and he let them do it. Listen when someone needed an ear. Answered directly when someone asked him something. But he didn't initiate, and people, reading him accurately, left him alone, which was exactly what he needed. The $500 sat untouched in the account he'd opened at a branch on Alameda. He paid rent from the warehouse checks. Food from the dollar grocery. Nothing more. Not because he was performing suffering. Because he wasn't ready to spend anything he hadn't earned since February. There was a line in his head, clean money on one side, everything before the courthouse on the other, and he wasn't crossing it until he was ready. Every evening, before he slept, he took out the small notebook, the same one he'd been keeping. Since the night he found a receipt in Camille's vest pocket. He'd fill it by another. He was on his second one now. 1 line per night. Not feelings, not analysis, just the true shape of the day in the fewest possible words. Day 41. Double shift. Dion said good work. Left hand, no rap needed. Day 47. Took the long way home. Quieter. Day 52. Evelyn came. She didn't stay long. That was fine. Simple things. Honest things. The kind of accounting that keeps a man tethered to his own life when everything else has been reorganized without his input. He read. He'd found a box of paperbacks left outside an apartment down the street with a hand-lettered sign that said free. And he'd taken 4 without reading the titles first. 2 of them turned out to be exactly the kind of book he'd never have chosen for himself. He read them with the particular attention of someone with nowhere better to direct it, which turned out to be better than reading something you've already decided you'll like. He slept, not well in the way sleep is supposed to be good, but consistently. His body knew the schedule now, knew what was expected. That was its own kind of order. And under the bed, in the padlocked box he'd carried on his lap on the bus the day he moved in, the brown envelope waited in the dark, with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time already and did not mind waiting a little more. On the other side of Houston, Camille and Darius Holt's marriage was producing content. That was the word that kept coming to Jerome's mind the one time he let himself look. Not life. Content. The rooftop reception 3 months after the divorce, the jazz quartet, the 47 posts that documented every angle of a single evening. Camille in white again, a different kind of dress this time, standing next to a man in a cream suit whose smile arrived and departed on schedule. The friends attended. People Jerome had known for 15 years had sat across from at dinner tables, had asked about their kids, had listened to their work problems on backyards and at cookouts. They went to the wedding and seemed to manage the transition without visible difficulty. Loyalty finds the direction of apparent success the way water finds the lowest point. Quickly, without effort, without anyone deciding to do it. Someone from Jerome's old workplace forwarded one of the posts to him. No message, just the forward. He looked at it for a moment, put his phone face down on the floor next to the mattress. He had worked in 4 hours. He slept. What Jerome did not know, lying on that mattress in those early months, was that the architecture of Darius Holt's empire had already begun to develop its first structural problems. Not visibly, not yet. From the outside, it still looked like what Darius needed it to look like, which was solid. But Darius had moved aggressively into 3 commercial development projects the previous fall, all of them in markets whose recovery he had badly overestimated. He'd borrowed against his existing portfolio to fund the acquisitions, brought in 2 partners who had money and confidence and not much else underneath either one. The tenants didn't come. The financing costs didn't flex the way the projections said they would. The first partner found a door his attorney had located that was technically ajar. He walked through it in January. The second followed in February. This left Darius personally exposed on terms he'd guaranteed in a period of unchecked optimism, which is the kind of exposure that has ended careers far more insulated than his. Camille didn't have the full picture yet. She had something else, the texture of a man whose energy had changed. The bathroom door closed during phone calls that hadn't been closed during before. The jaw held differently at dinner. The particular quality of silence that presents itself as comfortable but isn't. She filed it. She'd always been a filer. Precise, organized, storing information until she knew what to do with it. She just wasn't ready yet to open that particular folder. The first Sunday Evelyn showed up at the Del Mar room, she didn't call ahead. She just knocked. Jerome opened the door, and she was standing there with 2 covered containers and the expression of a woman who had decided something and was not going to be talked out of it. She looked at the room, took in once fully the way she took everything in completely and without commentary. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress because there was nowhere else to sit, set the containers down, and looked at her brother. "You okay?" she said. Jerome sat on the floor, back against the wall. "Getting familiar with okay," he said. She opened the containers. They ate. She talked about her rotation in the hospital, nothing specific, just the shape of it, the rhythms of a job that ran on its own clock regardless of what was happening outside. She mentioned a neighbor whose dog had learned to open the gate by itself, which Jerome found hard to believe. "I watched it," Evelyn said. "Twice." He almost smiled, which was something. She didn't ask about Camille. Didn't ask about the settlement, or the money, or what his plan was, or when he was going to tell her things were better. She was his sister. She knew the difference between the kind of silence that needed filling and the kind that needed company. When she stood to leave, she glanced once at the padlocked box visible under the bed. Then she looked at Jerome. "You keeping that safe?" she said. "It's safe," he said. She left. Her footsteps went down the hall. The stairwell door opened and closed. Jerome sat alone in the quiet room, listened to the radiator work. Outside, the wind moved the chain-link fence in its slow, indifferent way. He reached under the bed, held the padlock for a moment, then let go, put his hand back on his knee. Not yet, but closer than he'd been yesterday. He turned off the light, got on the mattress, pulled the blankets up. Something was coming. He didn't know what. He just knew the texture of waiting had shifted somewhere in the last few days, from enduring to almost something else, from sitting still to something that felt very quietly like readiness. He closed his eyes, slept. Denise Carter spent 6 days trying to find Jerome Caldwell. She was the head of investor relations at Solaris Energy, which meant her job included making sure that every equity holder from the seed round was located, verified, and contacted before the acquisition closed. Most of them had been straightforward. People who had invested early in a company that had just finalized a $44 billion acquisition tended to be findable. Attorneys, managers, people with the professional infrastructure around them designed, among other things, to receive exactly this kind of call. Jerome Caldwell had none of that. His email address on file bounced. His phone number had been disconnected. The home address in the system, a house in North Houston, was now registered to a Camille Holt. Denise tried 3 forwarding services. 2 came back empty. 1 gave her a post office box that had been closed. She went back to the original file, found a single emergency contact at the bottom. A personal number, not a professional one, listed as family. Gloria Caldwell, Beaumont. Denise called on a Tuesday morning. Gloria answered on the second ring. The way she answered told Denise something immediately, not the hello, but the readiness of it. A woman who lived alone and picked up phones promptly because a ringing phone is a thing that deserves an answer. Denise explained who she was, the company, that she needed to reach Jerome Caldwell in connection with an important financial matter and had exhausted every other avenue. Gloria said, "He's my son." "Yes, ma'am." A pause. Not suspicion exactly, more like assessment. Gloria Caldwell was weighing something. "What kind of financial matter?" "I'm not able to share the details, Mrs. Caldwell, but I need him to contact us before a deadline that's coming up quickly." Another pause. There was something in Denise's voice that Gloria heard. Not desperation. Denise was too professional for that. But something real underneath the professionalism. The specific quality of a person who needs to find someone for a reason that matters and has been running out of options. Gloria gave her the address. Then she hung up and called Jerome. He was lying on the mattress in the dark. 11:12 at night. The double shift had ended 3 hours ago, but his body was still carrying it, that specific exhausted stillness where you can't tell anymore if you're resting or just not moving. His phone lit up. His mother's name. She never called this late. He picked up. "Hey, Mama." "Baby." The thing in her voice. The thing she'd used maybe 4 times in his whole life. The one that meant she was managing herself carefully around something that required managing. "There's a woman been trying to find you." Said it was important. Very polite. Professional. He waited. She said the name twice, so I'd remember it. Solaris. Solaris Energy. Jerome didn't say anything. 1 second. 2. 3. "Baby." "Yeah." His voice came out even. It surprised him. "Thank you, Mama. I'll handle it." "You okay?" "I'm good. Get some sleep. I'll call you tomorrow." He set the phone down on the mattress. Sat in the dark. His heart was doing something it hadn't done in months. Not racing. Something quieter than that. Just announcing itself. The way a thing does when it has been very still for a long time and is about to move. He reached under the bed, opened the box, took out the brown envelope, held it. He'd held it 100 times. Knew the weight of it. Knew the way the paper had softened at the folds for being picked up and put back down so many times over so many years. He turned it over once in his hands. Then he put it back, closed the lid, locked it. Not tonight. He wanted to hear it from a person first. Wanted to sit in the same room with whatever this was before he opened anything. Let it be real in 3 dimensions before he let it be real on paper. He lay back down, stared at the ceiling, slept better than he had in weeks. Denise Carter arrived at the Del Mar address on Wednesday morning at 9:15. Gray company sedan, navy blazer, leather folder under one arm. She'd located early investors in circumstances ranging from absurdly comfortable to genuinely difficult. She was professional about all of it. It was the job. She pulled into the small parking area. Looked at the building. Gray brick. 3 stories. A front door with a buzzer panel that had 3 names on it, one written in pencil. She got out. Found the staircase. Room 214. Knocked twice. Jerome opened the door. He was in his warehouse clothes, the early shift already done. His hands had the look of hands that had been working outdoors in the cold. And the set of his face was the specific stillness of someone who had been awake since before it was reasonable and had stopped expecting the day to get easier as it went. Denise took in the room in one look. She didn't study it. She just registered it the way her eyes registered everything quickly, accurately, without making it mean more than it meant. She said, "Jerome Caldwell?" "Yes." "Denise Carter. Solaris Energy." She held out her card. He took it. "Read it." stepped back from the door. She came in. There was a shelf by the wall. She set her folder on it, opened it, and placed a single sheet of paper where he could see it. One page. Clean. The acquisition summary at the top, his equity stake confirmed in the middle, and at the bottom, a number. $38,700,000. Jerome looked at it. Read it once. Read it again. Denise stood with her hands at her sides and let the room be what it needed to be. She learned not to narrate these moments. The number said what it said. Her job was to stay present and let it land. He looked up. His face was the stillest she'd seen in 11 years of this work. Not shocked, not performing calm, just still, the way very deep water is still. Everything accounted for, nothing disturbed. He asked 4 questions. When does the acquisition close? She told him the following Monday. What's the tax treatment on the payout? She walked him through it in plain terms, no softening. What's the practical difference between lump sum and structured disbursement over 3 years? She laid it out, the numbers, the implications, the timeline of each. Were the last 4 digits of the account they have on file. She confirmed them. He nodded once after each answer, not writing anything down. He didn't need to. He was processing it the way he processed everything, completely, quietly, in order. When the last question was answered, he extended his hand. She shook it. Call me Thursday, she said. We'll schedule the documentation review. Thursday, he said. She picked up her folder, moved to the door. She'd said something at the end of one of these conversations exactly once in 11 years. She told herself afterward it was unprofessional, and she'd been right, and she didn't regret it. She said it again now. Calvin Webb told that story every year at the company retreat, she said. The man who stayed after the seminar and asked about scale instead of the technology. She looked at Jerome. That was you. He looked back at her. She left. Her footsteps went down the hall. The stairwell door opened and swung closed. Jerome stood in the room alone. He looked at the paper on the shelf. Sat down on the edge of the mattress. Slowly, the way you sit when your legs make a quiet, sensible decision on your behalf. He looked at his hands, at the floor, at the box under the bed. And then Jerome Caldwell laughed, out loud, by himself, in a room that cost $340 a month. Not hysterical, not the broken kind, the full kind, the kind that takes up all the space in a room and has no interest in being modest about it. It came out of him like something that had been compressed for a very long time under a great deal of weight and had finally found the opening. He laughed until the walls had heard it, until the radiator knocked back at him like it was participating, until his shoulders had done the thing shoulders do when the laugh is real. Then it stopped. He sat still, wiped his face with the back of his hand, reached under the bed, opened the box, took out the brown envelope for the last time, broke the seal. The statements inside were 14 of them, 1 per year. The paper on the earliest ones had yellowed slightly at the edges and gone soft in the way that paper goes when it's been handled without being read. He read them in order, first to last, following 14 years from a night he'd wired $14,000 into a company that 43 people in a beige convention room had decided wasn't worth their full attention through the slow years, the plateau years, the 2 years he'd held the envelope in the dark and wondered whether he was a man who'd made a good decision or a man who was too stubborn to admit he'd made a poor one. He'd held. That was all he'd done. Just held. The final statement didn't look like the others. The column that held the share valuation was in a different range entirely. Not the same scale. Not the same world. He read it twice, folded all 14 back into the envelope, put the envelope in the box, closed the lid, did not lock it, lay back on the mattress with his arms at his sides, stared at the ceiling. The neighbor down the hall was watching television again. The same type of show it always seemed to be, a studio audience laughing at regular intervals at something Jerome couldn't hear from here, but somehow felt the shape of. He closed his eyes and slept the way a man sleeps when the thing he's been holding has been set down somewhere safe. Spring in Houston doesn't arrive. It asserts itself, One day the air is the gray, cold weight of February, and the next it has made a decision and implemented it completely, warmth and humidity and the smell of things opening up. And the city moves, with it the way a city moves when the temperature reminds it of itself. Darius Holt's life moved differently. The Range Rover went on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. Camille was at an appointment, the kind she kept on a precise schedule, the kind that required a specific person and could not be rescheduled without 3 weeks' notice. She came out afterward and stood in the parking lot with her bag over one shoulder and watched a flatbed truck moving her husband's car out of the lot and into traffic. She stood there for a long time. A woman pushed a stroller past her. A man in a uniform jogged by, without looking up. The truck merged and was gone. Camille stood on the curb in the Houston spring sun, with her bag over her shoulder, and looked at the space where the car had been. Darius called 40 minutes later. She was still in the lot, engine running, air conditioning on, not going anywhere. He said the word strategic 4 times in the first 2 minutes. She said, okay. She'd heard that tone before. Not from Darius, from the voice inside her own head in the years before she'd left her first marriage. The tone of someone explaining something complicated as a way of not explaining something simple. She drove home. The house, the real one, the one with the landscaping they'd had done the first month, was listed by the following week. A for sale, Darius's attorney called it, which was accurate in every way, but the one that mattered. They moved to an apartment in a neighborhood that was perfectly livable and felt, every morning, like something had been decided about her without her permission. Renee's messages grew shorter. Dana went quiet. The social media that had been so consistent, so curated, so aggressively present, it slowed. Then slowed more. Then stopped the way clocks stop, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of moments where no one wounded. Camille was good at surfaces. She'd always been. She maintained her posture. She went to work. She answered her emails. She managed the specific performance of a woman who has not been publicly diminished and intends to keep it that way. But there were mornings, standing in the kitchen of the apartment with the lower ceilings, the light coming through a window that faced the wrong direction, coffee getting cold, while she stood there looking at nothing in particular, thinking about something she couldn't name, a quality, a consistency, something that had been present in her life for 22 years, and whose absence she kept reaching for like a word she'd forgotten. She was starting to understand what the word was. She just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Jerome left Delmar Street on a Thursday in late May. He didn't mark the occasion, packed the same way he'd arrived for boxes and the padlock box, which he carried himself rather than let it go in the moving truck with the rest. He took one last look at the room, the shelf where the kettle had been, the wall with nothing on it, the floor where he'd sat, with his back against the wall, eating Evelyn's food. He didn't feel nostalgic about it. It had been what it needed to be. That was enough. Raymond Booker's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Louisiana Street, with a view of downtown Houston that Raymond paid no attention to, because Raymond Booker's attention was on the work, and the work was never out the window. He was 58 years old. He wore glasses he was permanently slightly annoyed by, and had an assistant named Lorraine, who communicated primarily through the architecture of her silences. His office had no art on the walls. Jerome noticed that immediately and approved of it. They met 4 times before Jerome signed anything. Raymond walked him through every structure, lump sum versus disbursement, holding company versus direct ownership, exposure, timing, sequence. He presented each option with the same flat precision, no editorial, no push toward any particular direction. Jerome asked questions the way he asked every question. Specific, grounded. He didn't perform understanding, and he didn't perform confusion. He either knew or he didn't, and when he didn't, he said so and waited for the answer. After the 3rd meeting, Raymond told Lorraine, that man knew what he wanted when he walked in. I'm just the architecture. The house Jerome bought was on a quiet road in the northern edge of the suburbs. large without being designed to announce itself. Set back from the street under 3 oak trees old enough to have been there before the neighborhood was a neighborhood. The back garden was overgrown in the specific way that says something was once cared for here and would respond to attention again. He moved in on a Thursday, set up the coffee maker, a real one with a carafe because he was done with the kettle, and put the padlock box on the shelf above the desk in the study. Unlocked. Open. He also, in the weeks that followed, registered ground line capital with the state of Texas, a small venture firm, seed and early stage green energy. 2 analysts, both in their late 20s, both passed over by larger operations for reasons Jerome found unpersuasive. He told them on their first day they were looking for people who were 10 years early, and that early and wrong looked identical for longer than most people could tolerate, which was exactly why it was valuable when you could hold. And ground line foundation, no unknown cement, a website with plain language about what it did, micro grants and mentorship for divorced parents, and single heads of household rebuilding financial stability after family court. Referral pipelines built quietly through social workers and legal aid offices across Harris County. His name was not on the public materials. He was not building something to look at. He was closing holes he'd personally fallen through because he knew their exact shape from the inside. Evelyn came by on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks after Jerome moved into the house. He watched her from the front window. She stood in the driveway looking up at the house the way she looked at everything that mattered to her, which was to say completely and for longer than most people would before saying a word. He opened the door. She looked at him, looked at the house, looked at him again. "Okay," she said, which covered everything. They sat in the back garden, still overgrown, the afternoon light coming through the oak trees in the particular way it comes, through old trees, broken up and warm and moving. She brought food. They ate without making it mean more than it was. She talked about her hospital rotation, a patient situation she couldn't give him details about, the neighbor's dog, which had apparently moved past gates and was now managing car doors, which Jerome still found hard to believe. "I have a video," she said. "I'll need to see it," he said. They sat in the overgrown garden until the light went long and the day wound down into that specific Houston early evening that smells like things cooling at the edges. He didn't talk about Camille. She didn't ask. She was there. That was what mattered. That was always what mattered with Evelyn. When she stood to leave, she looked at the garden. "What are you going to do with all this?" she said. Jerome looked at the overgrown beds, the ground that had been left alone long enough to need reintroducing to itself. "Work on it," he said. She nodded, like that was the right answer. Which it was. It was a weekday evening 3 weeks after Evelyn's Sunday visit when she called. He was in the study, standing at the window that looked out over the front garden, the one he'd been thinking about since he moved in. The oak trees were doing their evening thing, shifting in the light breeze, their shadows moving across the stone wall in a slow, easy way. Evelyn called at 6:40. He picked up. She had the energy of someone who'd been sitting on something for a few hours and had made a decision. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay. I saw Camille today." Jerome was quiet. "I was driving back from the grocery on Ella. I went past the front of your street." A pause. There was a sedan going slow past your house. Then slower. He waited. "I recognized her before she saw me." Evelyn said this carefully. She was precise with what she knew and what she didn't. "I saw her face before she knew anyone was watching." "What did she look like?" A longer pause. Evelyn looking for the right words, which always meant she was going to get them right. "Like somebody who just found something they'd been trying not to look for." Jerome stood at the window. The oak trees moved. "She saw me. When she looked up," Evelyn said. "We looked at each other for a second. Then the light changed and she drove." He said, "Okay. I thought you should know. I appreciate it." Jerome, "Yeah. Whatever you decide to do with it," she said. "I'm here." He said, "I know." They hung up. He stood at the window a moment longer. The oak trees, the stone wall, the early evening light making everything it touched look considered. Then he went to the kitchen. made coffee, sat at the table, thought about the garden, what it needed, what was worth putting in the far bed, what would come back on its own if given the right conditions, and what would need consistent attention. And whether those two things were even that different from each other when you thought about it long enough. He got out the notebook, a new one, not the Delmar one. He'd started it the week he moved into the house. He opened it to a blank page, wrote more than one line for the first time in months. Native grasses for the far bed, something that comes back. Low maintenance, but real. Check with the nursery on Ella about what's established in this soil already. Don't rush the back section. Let it tell you what it wants first. He closed the notebook, picked up his coffee, sat in the kitchen of his house on a weekday evening in late June, and felt for the first time since February that the shape of the life he was living had started to resemble something he'd actually chosen. Not arrived at, chosen. That was the difference. That was what the work had been for. 3 weeks after Evelyn's phone call, on a Thursday evening in mid-July, the gate intercom at Jerome's house buzzed at 6:47. He was in the back garden, working the soil along the far bed, the one he decided would take the native grasses and maybe 2 or 3 things that would come back on their own without being asked. His hands were dirty. He had a glass of water on the stone ledge behind him that had gone warm. The evening light was doing the thing it did in late June in Houston, pulling long and amber across everything, making the garden look like it was being preserved in something. Sandra appeared at the back door. "Someone at the gate," she said. He didn't look up. "Who?" A pause. The pause of a woman who understood context and was delivering information carefully. "She says her name is Camille." Jerome was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, the soil in the creases of his knuckles. "Let her in," he said. "Tell her I need a few minutes." Sandra went back inside. Jerome finished the row he was working, not performatively, not to make a point, just because the row needed finishing, and he'd been taught a long time ago that you completed what you started before you moved to the next thing. He stood, took his time, brushed off his hands on the work cloth he kept draped over the stone ledge, picked up the glass, and drank the rest of the warm water, set it back, walked inside through the kitchen, washed his hands at the sink, took his time there too, dried them, walked to the sitting room. Camille was standing near the window, not sitting, standing, the way people stand in rooms they're not sure they belong in, weight distributed carefully, hands held close, the posture of someone managing themselves. She was wearing a black dress, simple cut, fitted, ending just above the knee, low heels, hair down and pressed straight, falling past her shoulder in a way that caught the light from the window. No rings, not on either hand. She looked the way she always looked, which was the complicated part. She still had that thing, the quality Jerome had noticed in a backyard in 3rd Ward 27 years ago, where her presence in a room reorganized the air in it. She was 50 years old, and she looked like time had made a considered decision about her, and that decision was favorable. Even now, even in a simple black dress in a room she wasn't sure she was allowed to be in. She looked at the room first, the understated furniture, the bookshelves, the window with the garden visible behind it, the way the space was arranged, not to impress, just to be comfortable, which was its own kind of statement. Something moved across her face. Not pain exactly, not recognition exactly, something that lived in the neighborhood between those two things and didn't have a name she'd been using. She looked at Jerome. "Jerome," she said. "Camille." He sat down, gestured to the chair across from him. She sat on the edge of it, which was the right thing to notice. She sat like someone who wasn't certain they'd earned the whole seat. And then she talked. He let her. He'd always been good at letting people talk. It wasn't patience in the way people usually meant. That word wasn't gritting your teeth through what someone was saying while you waited for your turn. It was genuine. He was interested in what people revealed when you gave them room to move without obstacles. She talked about Darius first, how it started, the networking event, his attention, which had been precise and specific and had arrived at a moment when she'd been worn down in ways she hadn't fully admitted to herself. She talked about the charm, how real it had seemed, and how gradually, not all at once, she'd begun to see that what she'd mistaken for depth was presentation. A very convincing surface that went most of the way through but not quite. She talked about the manipulation. Not dramatic, subtle. The way he'd framed her choices, so that the choice he wanted always seemed like the one she was making freely. The way he'd talked about Jerome, which she understood now she should have heard differently. She paused here, looked at her hands. Then she talked about the trial. Patricia Graves had been effective. Camille had wanted things reframed. She hadn't authorized everything that got reframed. There was a difference, she said, between asking someone to present your case in the best light and watching them build a version of events that didn't fully belong to you. She didn't say this to exonerate herself. Jerome could hear that. She said it because it was true and because she was trying to give him the full accounting, which was the only kind of accounting that served anything. She cried twice, not at strategic moments, not in a way that was performing grief. The ugly, ungoverned kind of crying. The kind where your face does what it does, without asking for your permission. The first time she seemed surprised by it. She pressed her fingers under her eyes and breathed. Kept going. Jerome watched her through all of it. Didn't interrupt. Didn't reach toward her or pull back from her. Just stayed present in the way he'd always been present, which was completely. When she stopped talking, the room was very quiet. Not uncomfortable, just full of something that didn't need words yet. Jerome leaned forward in the chair, clasped his hands. I knew about Darius, he said. From the 11th month. Camille went completely still. Not just quiet. Still. The way a room goes still when something is about to change. A receipt, he said. In the pocket of your gray vest. A restaurant on Westheimer. The date matched the night you said you were working late. He paused. I read it 3 times in the kitchen with the light off. She wasn't breathing at a normal rate. He could see that. I didn't say anything that night, he said. I put the receipt in my own jacket, went to the kitchen, wrote the date and the address in my notebook. Made tea, went to bed. He looked at her steadily. Over the next 4 months, I gathered phone records. Credit card statements cross-referenced against your calendar. A photograph from the parking structure on Westheimer. I kept it all in the notebook. When the notebook filled up, I started a second one. Camille's hands were pressed flat on her knees. By the time you had Patricia Graves draw up the papers, Jerome said, I had enough to walk into that courtroom and take the whole thing apart. I could have taken the house, both cars, contested the asset division entirely. With what I had, I would have won. He stopped. Let that land. Let her sit with it. You had all of that, she said. Barely above a breath. I had all of that. She looked at him, those brown eyes, still as deep as they'd always been, still reading him the way she'd always read rooms, finding something she hadn't expected to find. Why didn't you use it? He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer. He knew it now, had known it fully since the night on the thin mattress when he'd laughed alone in the dark. He was quiet because the answer deserved to be said correctly, which was plainly without theater. Because I didn't want you to stay, because you were afraid of the consequences of leaving, he said. I didn't want to win by building a cage. I didn't want your choice cornered. I wanted it free. She pressed one hand over her mouth. And he paused, because I had to be honest with myself about something. 22 years, Camille. Both of us. Neither of us was fully honest with the other about what we actually needed. The distance between us, I contributed to that. Not as much as the way the papers described it, but some of it was mine. A long silence. She shook her head once, not disagreeing, just absorbing. That's why I smiled, he said, when I signed the papers. Not because of money, not because I knew things were going to be fine. He looked at her, because it was the first moment in years where I didn't have to pretend, where I wasn't waiting for something to get better or bracing for something to get worse. The choice was made. Everything was what it was. And for the first time in a very long time, I was just myself. He settled back in the chair. That's all the smile was. That's the whole thing. Camille put her hand over her mouth again. The sound she made was not quite crying, not quite anything else with a proper name. The sound a person makes when something they've been holding very tight finally releases, and they weren't fully prepared for what that would feel like. Jerome watched her, not coldly, not with distance, but without moving toward her, because what she was feeling needed to be hers. After a moment, he said, "I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that. Whatever I was holding in those first months, I worked through it. I'm not carrying it." She looked up. His voice was level, decided. The voice he used when he knew what he was going to say and had known it before he sat down. "But I'm not going to reconcile with you, Camille. Not because of the affair. Not even because of the trial." He held her gaze. "Because we spent 22 years in a marriage where we were both quietly unhappy in ways we didn't say out loud. That isn't something I want to go back to, for either of us." She nodded. One small movement. The nod of a woman who had come prepared to hear something hard and had heard it and was not going to fall apart. He stood. "What I can tell you is that you're capable. You're smart. You've always been the sharpest person in any room you walked into." He looked at her directly. "What you build from here is going to depend entirely on the quality of your choices. Same as it always did. Same as it does for everybody." Camille stood too, slowly, with the care of someone whose legs needed a moment to decide they were ready. She picked up her bag. At the doorway to the hall, she stopped. Turned back once. Those deep brown eyes found his face. "The smile," she said. "I thought about it for months. I couldn't figure out what it meant." "I know," he said. She looked at him for one more moment, reading the room, the way she always did. Then she nodded once, walked to the front door. Sandra, somewhere deeper in the house, made no sound at all. The front door opened, closed. The gate clicked shut outside. Jerome stood in the sitting room and listened to the sedan pull away from the curb. When the sound was gone, he walked back through the kitchen, out to the back garden, picked up his work cloth, stood in the evening light under the oak trees. Then he went back to work on the garden bed, because the row still had another 8 feet to go. And the light was still good. The Ground Line Foundation's first gathering happened on a Saturday evening in late September, 10 weeks after Camille's visit. Jerome had resisted calling it an event. The word implied something organized around performance, around a center that people faced. What he wanted was something closer to what it actually was, a group of people who had survived something specific coming together in a space that didn't require them to be further along than they were. 17 people came, not all at once. They arrived in the way people arrive, when they're still recalibrating their sense of where they belong in social spaces, some tentative, some overcompensating with energy, some just quiet and watchful until they could read the room. There were men who had walked out of family court with less than Jerome had. Men who had lost not just assets, but access. Men who were trying to rebuild credit, while also rebuilding the more fundamental thing that credit depends on, which is believing that the architecture of your future hasn't been permanently damaged. There were women too. Fewer, but there. Single mothers whose situations had different features, but the same essential shape, the specific combination of public exposure and private collapse that follows when a family structure comes apart in a legal setting that wasn't designed to be gentle about it. Sandra had organized the food because Jerome had told her it should be good food, and she'd taken that seriously. There were containers and covered dishes and things that smelled like someone's grandmother had been involved, which was exactly right. Jerome moved through the gathering the way he moved through most things, without taking up the center, without presiding. He spoke to people when they came to him, listened when they needed to be heard, asked the kind of questions that weren't really questions but were invitations to say more, to say the thing underneath the thing. He didn't talk about himself. That wasn't what the evening was for. A man named Bernard found him near the stone wall at the back of the garden, a little past 8, when the evening had settled into the specific quality of late September in Houston, which is generous and warm and smells like things cooling at the edges. Bernard was 44. He had the hands of a man who'd worked with them his whole life and the posture of someone who'd been carrying weight for a long time and was only recently starting to put some of it down. He had a fabrication business, small, just him and one other person, that he'd opened 4 months ago with the help of a ground line micro grant. He'd requested the grant 11 months earlier from a form on a website that listed no name, no founder, no face. Just the criteria and the process. Bernard had written his application by hand because his printer was broken, and he wasn't going to let that stop him. He described his situation plainly, the divorce, the proceedings, the aftermath, the specific thing he was trying to build, and why he believed he could build it. The grant had been approved in 12 days. Bernard hadn't known who was behind it until 3 weeks ago, when a social worker who'd referred him to the foundation mentioned the founder's name in a context that assumed he already knew. He hadn't known. He'd spent 3 weeks deciding whether to come to this gathering, not because of the money, because of something more complicated than that. The particular feeling of being helped by a person you didn't know, which can be either freeing or uncomfortable depending on what you need from the exchange. He decided to come because he wanted to say something, and he figured if the man had gone to the trouble of not putting his name on the website, he was probably the kind of man you could say things to without it becoming a performance. Jerome was standing near the wall, glass in hand, when Bernard came over. Caldwell. Jerome looked at him. Bernard, I want to say something, and I'm going to say it once, so you don't have to figure out how to respond to me saying it twice. Jerome waited. I wasn't going to make it, Bernard said. Not, he paused, chose the word. Not dramatically. I wasn't in danger, but the trajectory of the thing, where it was going. Another 18 months on that road, and I wouldn't have had enough left to start over from. He looked at the garden, then back at Jerome. The grant wasn't just money. It was the first time in 2 years something happened that said, this is recoverable. You're in a recoverable situation. He paused again. That's not a small thing to give a person. Jerome looked at him. You kept the application, Jerome said. Bernard looked at him. The one you wrote by hand. Because your printer was broken. Jerome took a drink from his glass. Lorraine, my operations director, mentioned it when the file came through. Said it was the most honest application she'd read in a year. Bernard shook his head once, not in disbelief, in the way people shake their heads at the smallness of the margins sometimes, the distance between what happened and what could have happened instead. You want to know something? Bernard said. Sure. My uncle always told me that the people who help you up when you're down, they're not doing it to feel good about themselves. They're doing it because they know what the ground looks like from down there. He looked at Jerome. He was right. Jerome said, Your uncle sounds like my father. Bernard said, What did your father say? Take care of them, Jerome said. That's the whole job. Bernard looked at him for a moment. Then he put out his hand. Jerome shook it. Not the handshake of a transaction. The other kind. The evening went on. The conversations moved and branched and doubled back. Someone laughed loudly from near the food table, the kind of laugh that made everyone nearby turn their head, wanting to be included in whatever had caused it. 2 men who hadn't met before sat down in the garden chairs and were still talking when the light had gone amber and soft. Jerome noticed all of it without making himself the audience for it. He was part of the room, not in front of it, which was exactly what he'd wanted. Near 9 o'clock, when the gathering was winding toward its end in the organic way these things wind down, coats picked up, containers retrieved, the conversations becoming shorter and more conclusive, Jerome stood at the edge of the garden, near the far bed he'd planted 6 weeks ago. The native grasses had come up. Not fully, not yet, but up, doing the slow, committed work of establishing themselves in new ground. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at the house. The lights on inside. Sandra moving through the kitchen, doing the thing she did, which was restore order without commentary. The oak trees overhead, dark against the September sky, holding very still. He thought about a courtroom in February. Cold marble floor. A cheap plastic pen that skipped if you pressed too hard. He thought about the thin mattress on Delmar Street. The radiator that knocked at night. The padlock box under the bed. The brown envelope he'd held 100 times and finally opened in the dark, after a woman in a navy blazer had placed a single piece of paper on a shelf next to a kettle. He thought about the seminar room. 43 people, fluorescent lights, a young man with an iron shirt, and an idea so large he could barely contain it inside a beige conference room at Houston Convention Center. He thought about a backyard in Third Ward, a borrowed speaker, someone's uncle managing the grill, a yellow sundress. He thought about a small church on the east side, 30 people, his father's hand on his shoulder. Take care of them. That's the whole job. He hadn't understood it then, not fully. He'd thought it meant Camille, and for a long time it had meant Camille. But standing in his garden on a late September evening, with 17 people winding down behind him, and native grasses coming up in the far bed, and the oak trees standing in the dark the way they'd stood for decades before he arrived, and would stand for decades after, he understood it differently now. It was bigger than one person. It was the whole thing. Everything you touched, everyone the work reached. The version of yourself you kept intact when everything around it came apart, so that when the time came you had something real to offer instead of just the appearance of it. He had held himself intact, not gracefully, not without cost, not with any certainty that it was going to be worth what it took. Just intact, the way the envelope had stayed intact in the box under the bed. Sealed, holding its contents until the right moment. And then the moment came, and what was inside was real. Bernard was leaving, nodding at Jerome from across the garden, one hand raised. Jerome raised his glass. Two men near the gate were shaking hands, exchanging numbers. The woman who had been quiet all evening was standing, with Sandra near the kitchen door, laughing at something Sandra had said, which meant Sandra had decided the evening was going well enough to be slightly funny, which was high praise. The last guest left just before 10. Jerome helped Sandra carry the last of the things inside. She moved through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew the way. He didn't try to help her organize. He just moved what needed moving and let her direct. When she was done, she said, "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," which was what she said at the end of every day she worked, and picked up her bag and left. Jerome walked through the quiet house, turned off the lights in the sitting room, the kitchen, the hall, went to the study, turned on the desk lamp, sat down. The padlock box was on the shelf above the desk. Open now. He'd kept it open since the day Denise Carter left room 214 on Delmar Street. The brown envelope was still inside, the paper statements stacked in order, the oldest ones soft at the folds. He looked at the box for a moment. Then he opened the small notebook, not the Delmar notebook, a new one he'd started the week he moved into the house, and picked up the pen. He didn't write one line. He wrote 3. The first, "Good people came tonight." The second, "Bernard Ware's uncle was right." The third, "Father was right too. Always." He closed the notebook, sat back. The study was quiet. Through the window, the oak trees moved in a light wind, their shapes visible against the dark sky, patient and enormous, and completely at ease in the ground they'd grown in. Jerome sat for a while. He thought about the smile, the one in the courtroom, the one no one had understood, including himself, not completely, not then. He understood it now. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't the smile of a man who knew about an investment account or a sealed brown envelope or anything that was going to happen next. He didn't know any of that with certainty when he put that pen down. What he'd known, what he'd felt, what the smile had been the surface of, was something simpler and harder to name. He was still himself. That was it. That was all of it. He'd walked out of that building with $500. And that man, the one who leaned forward in a beige conference room when everyone else was looking at the door, intact. No courtroom had dissolved him. No settlement had transferred him. That was the only thing that had ever really been his to keep. Turns out it was enough. He turned off the desk lamp, walked through the dark house, out the back door, into the garden. The September air was warm, and still the kind of warm that's comfortable rather than heavy, that makes you want to stay outside longer than you planned. The oak trees were very dark against the sky. The native grasses in the far bed were invisible in the dark, but he knew they were there, doing their slow, committed work. He stood in the garden for a while, not thinking about anything particular. Just standing, in his own garden, under his own trees, in his own September air. A man who had lost everything a courtroom could take, and had not lost anything that actually mattered. He stood there until the night settled around him completely, until the sounds of the neighborhood quieted to the ones that stay a distant car, a dog somewhere 3 streets over, the wind moving through leaves in the way it has moved through leaves forever. Then he went inside, made coffee he actually drank this time, and sat at the kitchen table in the light, alone, in the house he'd chosen at the end of a day that had been exactly what he'd built it to be. Which, when you have spent enough time in rooms that weren't yours, in lives that didn't quite fit, in marriages that had stopped telling the truth about themselves long before anyone said so out loud, when you have spent enough time in all of that, and come through it, and arrive somewhere real is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. Every last bit of it.